everyone, or good afternoon, I guess, today. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We are very pleased today to welcome back Evelyn George and to welcome Felix to continue our conversation on birthing supports. Specifically today, we're going to talk about pathways to midwifery, how you can get involved, and the importance, and reflect a little bit on kind of what that journey was like. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle. As always, sometimes the topics we cover can be sensitive or emotionally triggering. If you need to invest in some self-care today, please make sure that you do so. Talk to a friend, elder, counselor, family member, whatever you need. Make sure that you're looking after yourself. So, introductions. My name is Cole. I'm from the Chawatho First Nation. I'll be facilitating the discussion alongside Evelyn today, kind of taking part where I can. Other Learning Circle team members in the room but off camera today are Cynthia, our production coordinator. If you're following along on webinar and you'd like to introduce yourself on the Zoom chat box, please feel free to do so. So with that, I think I'm just going to pass the mic over to you guys, and you can introduce yourselves, and we'll kind of go from there. Evelyn, do you want to start, just in case there are people that missed it on the first session?
Sure. My name is Evelyn George. I'm a midwife, and I'm UBC Anishinaabe and French Canadian, and I'm glad to be here today. Miigwech.
Wife Warda, Friends Quest to Felix, Latching to Squatmek, Rutkika, Sheila Felix, Rutkia, Jeannie Haskett, Rutsla, Reverend Felix, and Earl Joe. And I also just wanted to say thank you for having me. And then as well as I'm Tia Felix. I'm from Slatcheen, which is one of 17 bands of the Shuswap territory, the most southern, so we do speak with a little bit of twang. But definitely a visitor here on the lovely territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Nation.
Okay, so what are we going to chat about? Want to take us off here, Evelyn?
Sure. Okay, so we were wanting to talk a little bit about, so we're kind of doing this childbearing series this spring, feeling like spring is an amazing time to talk about birth and renewal and this kind of thing. So just a couple of days ago, we had the Learning Circle about bringing birth back to our communities and what that can involve. And part of that conversation was about midwifery. So along that thread, we wanted to talk about how to become a midwife and the different pathways to midwifery and how to get involved in that regard. So with that, and this lovely photo that you just saw was from the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives. We'll talk a little bit about NACM's work today. So the goals for today is just talking about, what is midwifery and getting on the same page very briefly and very broadly, but also just to make sure that we cover that together. T and I will also talk about our own pathways to becoming midwives. We'll talk about learning midwifery across Canada and what the options are, learning Indigenous midwifery and about that, and then learning midwifery specifically here in BC. Okay. So what is and once in a while I'll pass it to Tia to talk about it a little bit as well. So what is midwifery? So Tia, do you want to go through the model of midwifery?
Ooh, okay. So just like your general scoping model?
Yeah.
Okay, for sure. So midwifery looks different across Canada, but I can speak to BC specifically, where here in BC, the word midwife cares for pregnant people who are in their prenatally, sometimes preconception, and then as well as throughout the pregnancy, labor, birth, and 6 to 8 weeks postpartum. And we're caring for low-risk healthy women. And also we are part of an interprofessional team here. So we work alongside nurses, physicians, obstetricians, and any specialists that are involved in your care specifically.
Yeah, and so across Canada, the three kind of linking themes in midwifery, one is continuity of care. So that's that we're doing our best effort to make sure that you're meeting the same person throughout your care. And then likewise, if you come back for more babies, that we are seeing you again and again, if that's the case. Also, Choice of birthplace is another important one. And so choice of birthplace means that for folks who are screening as low risk, we've kind of gone through all of the risk factors and we've decided that a birth out of hospital would be a safe option. Midwives are trained and skilled to provide care in the home or in another birth setting that's outside of the hospital. So in some parts of Canada, we have birth centers for things like that. And then informed choice and informed decision making, so that we spend the time. Our appointment times are longer, 30 to 45 minutes very often. So we get to know the family, get to know the people in our care, what their concerns are, and make sure we have time to share the information that's needed to make those big decisions that occur throughout the course of pregnancy. In terms of our scope, we have what we call a low risk scope, but there are certain things that midwives will do. So a lot of times people think, oh, I've had a C-section last time, I can't have a midwife this time. Actually, midwives do look after people who've had previous C-sections. And so one of the good resources to know what midwives can do and not do is to look up our guidelines. So the College of Midwives of BC has the guidelines for within BC, which is a good resource. And also just reaching out to your local midwifery clinic. So if you are interested in a midwife, they're very Googleable, or you can go to the Midwives Association of BC website and search for a midwife and find a midwife that way, and then just ask and say, is this something that's concerning? Can I have a midwife? And most often you're going to get the answer, yes, this is fine. Very often we work in partnership, as Tia was saying, so if risk factors arise throughout pregnancy, labor and birth, or in the postpartum, or with the newborn baby, we'll be working with that team of consultants, whether they're pediatricians or obstetricians or other colleagues in the community, to make sure that everybody's getting the best care possible. Do you want to describe what kind of a day in the life of a midwife looks like?
Oh. So day in the life of a midwife, that's a very big question.
Maybe a week in the life, because every day is just so different, right?
Yeah. So I find it interesting that a lot of the photos are us drinking tea, and that's, if I have time, I love a cup of tea, but typically the general rule is if you're not attending a labor or birth, you're running clinic. If you're not in clinic, you're doing postpartum visits and even sometimes prenatal visits, depending on the needs of the family. But generally, day to day, we're also in between those clinic visits and as well as labor and births. We also are on call 24 hours, 7 days a week, answering pages. So sometimes pages regarding like a newborn rash or engorgement or an early labor assessment. So it kind of varies day to day. Sometimes you'll have a quiet period for maybe a day or two, and then you'll have a birth storm, and then you'll just keep going. And of course, you'll get some naps in there and some rest and some food and visits. So it's been kind of constant.
Yeah, so we're in people's homes, checking in on them. We're at the hospital. Sometimes people are staying there for a couple of days. We'll check in on them. Depending on where a birth takes place, that's where we'll be kind of all over, right?
Yeah.
In the clinic, kind of meet you where you need us to be. I put this map up on the slide just to kind of demonstrate. This is from the website of the Canadian Association of Midwives. And this is, and they have information on the educational options there as well. But in terms of the kind of national view of people might say, I've never heard of midwives before. But then if you look in their province and, here in BC, 22% of all births are being attended by midwives. That's over 1 in 5, almost 1 in 4. So it's actually quite a lot more common and growing fairly rapidly as well. So that's reassuring. And so exciting to see. And of course, it does vary from area across the country, but I wanted to show you that. BC actually has the highest proportion of births being attended by midwives at this point in time. So that's a really great achievement for BC. And there's a picture of Tia weighing a baby in someone's home, which is a very real snapshot of something we do on an almost daily basis as midwives.
It's my favorite thing to come home and they're lying in bed and they're getting pampered and we're really meeting them where they're at. So I love it.
Yeah, we like people not to have to go far for us, that's for sure. So just, to note, we've always had Indigenous midwives. So very often people hear about us, they're like, oh, wow, that's, a new thing. It's really not. Our elders all have stories about midwives, about being born at home. And so my question to you is just to very briefly, do you know of an elder midwife in your community? Do you know the history of birth in your community and who the people were who attended those births? And how might they have learned what they know? I think we're always very much in a mindset of, well, you go to university, and here in BC we have a university program, but just kind of scaling back just a little bit and reflecting on how did this knowledge used to be learned and passed down? Because it's not actually that different from the way midwifery is taught and learned now once we get into the clinical setting. Obviously, the classroom setting is a very, very different thing. But if you're looking at this, it's a moment just to reflect, what was the learning of midwifery like at one time in your community, if you know, or imaginary community if you're thinking of somewhere else, and how was that knowledge passed on? And then another question I kind of wanted to reflect on before we kind of went much further is what matters when we're learning? So we know that Indigenous students will learn a little bit differently, right? Indigenous people have a much more kind of hands-on approach. Not everybody, but this is information that we have that, our learning has to be relevant and meaningful, and much more hands-on, I think. And midwifery is great for that because most of the program is hands-on learning. But getting through to that point can be a challenge. But what matters when we're learning? A supportive learning environment, a safe learning environment, resources, social supports, right? And just kind of reflecting on what are those things that we need to be successful in our learning. Okay. So our own stories. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. So initially, I've always known that I wanted to work in healthcare. I just didn't know exactly what that journey looked like ahead. So I first went to UBCO, which is a campus in Kelowna, and did a general science degree. And originally thinking that I was going to be a pharmacist. And then I did some shadowing and I realized that it just wasn't for me. However, my summer jobs, I worked as an environmental technician for Youth Midwifery, and there I was able to spend time with my elders, review medicines. I had a focus in vegetation, and still kind of just trucking along in my science degree. And then my sister in Kamloops had a midwife. At her birth, she delivered a lovely, healthy 11.5-pound water birth baby, and it was just so inspiring and so empowering and very supportive, and all our family was there, and I was like, what is this? And kind of all the light bulbs went off. And so after that, I became a birth doula, and I attended a few births, and I was hooked. But then actually now reflecting back, I attended all my siblings' births. I have 6 siblings. I didn't get to attend my older brother, but the rest I did. And even then I was rubbing my mom's back from the age of 4, getting her a cold cloth. And that's kind of, looking back, I've always seemed to, I guess, been pulled into this birth work and eventually ended up becoming a midwife. Now, in a few weeks, I'll be a full midwife, but right now I'm a midwifery clerk, so really close. And just, we get to practice our own medicines. At my sister's birth, there was singing and drumming. She had control of who the visitors were, and it was life-changing. And it was also healing for our elders and our parents to see such a supportive experience, especially during such a vulnerable time. And so that kind of was my story to midwifery. But I would love to hear Evelyns.
You'll notice on the title page, I didn't put a title for myself or for Tia, because Tia is kind of in this limbo between being a student midwife and being an official midwife. And so it's very exciting. I'm so glad you're here, Tia.
Oh, and just a little fun fact. In our language, in the Secwepemc, Canuchin means trustful helper, and that's what we call a midwife. So, little fun fact. And now thinking that, I was like, yes, I think that's a lot of my role. It's just, I'm just here to help and guide in whatever way I can.
Yeah. Great. I love hearing people's stories. Well, for me, it's funny when you mentioned about your childhood and kind of showing signs of being right for this work. I used to play babies with my sister all the time, and I'd carry my baby in my sweater, and I'd be like, I'm having a baby, and get my sister to catch my baby, and then I'd be like, your turn. Well, we'd play birth, and just this fascination with pregnancy and birthing from a very young age. And later on, I learned that my grandmothers on both sides of my families were midwives in their traditional ways. And so that's been really neat to learn. I entered university thinking I wouldn't go into health, actually, because I had got really tired in high school of math and sciences and stopped at the very minimum amount because for me, high school was really difficult. I nearly dropped out many times, and I just didn't want to do science and math anymore, and so I didn't. So I entered university in the social sciences, and through there I found Indigenous health classes, women's health classes, global health classes, and I completed a degree in health studies. But in my second year of that year, my auntie was having a baby, and she invited me to her midwife visit, and the midwife was like, oh, so you're going to be a midwife? And I was like, no, I don't know about this. And it actually came up in high school, too. They tried to get me to do a co-op at the midwife office, and I had said no to that as well. And then at her birth, I ended up being at her birth. She asked me to come as her helper, which was really such a gift. And I came and I was there for the birth, and I was just in awe. It was so powerful. I just was so blown away. And the midwife was like, so you're going to be a midwife? And I was like, no. But within a couple months, I had actually applied to the program, signed up for summer school science classes to meet the requirements to get into the program. And I was enrolled. I got accepted and did my sciences through that summer and started the next fall. So within a year of this baby's birth. And so it was really amazing. And just the courses that really led me into midwifery really gave me that immediate focus of, why this is so important for our communities and why this is so culturally important also, just in terms of maintaining our knowledge base and supporting people to bring culture into their birth and to revitalize our ways because they're wellness ways. They bring wellness to our communities, and that has value in healthcare, and it has value in all aspects of our lives. But as a healthcare provider, I feel like that's a really great place for us to be able to open doors and hold spaces for that work to happen, and for us to kind of dig deep within ourselves about what can we offer. So the summer between graduating, so I did a health studies degree at McMaster University, and that summer I met a traditional midwife who's fairly well known. Her name is Gudgie Cook. She's become a friend over the years, and she's also one of the founding members of the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives, and I met her in a ceremony traveling in the summer, and it really kind of grounded me before starting the university process of midwifery, because high school was such a struggle for me, but university was fine because I was interested. And midwifery was fine too, but reminding myself of that need for that cultural learning to be kind of as I went, kind of side by side the whole way through was really important, because I think we can get so lost in our university programs, and then we come out and we're like, oh my gosh, I've missed out on this entire area of learning, right? That is so important for how I'm going to work as a healthcare provider. And who I am as a care provider and as a trusted person in the community, right? So it was just a really grounding kind of time for me. And so midwifery was great. I got to do my placements at 7th Generation Midwives Toronto, which is an Indigenous specific urban practice in Toronto. So I went to Ryerson for my midwifery program, and just had so many great experiences, and have traveled to different places to do midwifery. in the northern remote communities in Nunavik. I did my first year practice in Saskatchewan, and made it out here somehow and stayed so far.
Right.
So it's been a journey, but it's been so positive, and I've loved doing this work of talking about midwifery and supporting people who are interested in becoming a midwife. Do you want to mention what you said earlier this morning?
Yeah. So I actually have a huge thank you to Crystal, who was she's from a community, and I kind of put out the word to my mom. I'm like, I'm thinking about midwifery. I don't know. We'll see. And along the grapevine, our Crystal heard, and she actually worked for UBC Learning Circle at that point. And she's just like, hey, Tia, she Facebooks me, and she's like, I hear you're interested in midwifery. And I was like, yeah, I'm thinking about it. And she's like, check out this UBC Learning Circle. It's this time, this day, so if you can make it, that'd be great. And so I was able to log on just as you are, and I actually saw Marika talking about midwifery and the needs and what the day-to-day looks like, and I was like, oh, that's kind of like already my day-to-day, doing home visits, checking in on people, like that's kind of already what I do, as well as juggling school. So I was like, oh, it won't be that big of a transition. I was wrong, but it was exactly what Marika said it would be, and more. And it was very rewarding. And I'm glad that I got to see this for UBC Learning Circle, and then as well as now get to participate on the other side. So it's kind of full circle.
So cool.
Yeah, very cool. The other thing I wanted to say there, just kind of reflecting on both of your responses, it's so great that midwifery kind of as a profession and in their place in the birthing process, you guys are able to really integrate traditional and cultural knowledge and values into your practice and making sure of that. You know, it's not always the same with all healthcare professions, so that's really, from my perspective, we talk a lot to different kind of healthcare professions on the Learning Circle, and that's something I'm really noting here, is that you guys seem to be able to be very grounded culturally and traditionally and carry that into your practice meaningfully.
Well, midwifery is a traditional role for our cultures, right? In our communities. It's not unfamiliar. It's very familiar. Every community has stories of midwives, and I think that brings a lot of meaning to being a midwife, and it encourages people into this kind of work too, to say like, oh gosh, maybe I can do that. And it's really neat. All of the university programs have found over the last few years the Indigenous application rate is really really increasing, and really a lot, proportionally higher than what you would expect, A program of 20 might get 8 Indigenous applicants, right? And so it's really exciting. There's some cultural relevancy there. And I think we really see that through the interest that is shown to the different programs across the country. So with that, we'll talk about learning midwifery across Canada. So there are university programs. Just very broadly, I'll tell you that there's one in Quebec. There are 3 university programs in Ontario. There is one developing in Manitoba, there is one in Alberta, and there's one in BC. And then community-based programs. And then there was one rotating program in Nunavut as well, which is through Arctic College. That one is not continuing at this time, but Arctic College is a college that when there are gaps, they'll bring the program back to do that. So hopefully one day we'll see more midwives there as well. Community-based programs are communities where they've taken control over the education process for midwifery. So the first programs to come up were in the region of Nunavik, which is in northern Quebec. And there are 4 sites now actually there for learning midwifery. And so when we say community-based, we mean that folks from the community are able to stay local and learn. And for Nunavik, they're learning in Inuktitut language, and it's a competency-based learning approach. So, as you get your different skill set and your knowledge base that you kind of go, you progress through the years. What's really wonderful about community-based learning is it works really well for Indigenous, they're all Indigenous community based programs, but they work really well because we know that there are times in your life where you might need to slow down, other times in your life where you're able to take on more. And so these programs are done at the pace of the learner. So it could be 4 years, it could be 7 years. We've seen it take even longer for people who've had several children, throughout the course of their education, but who are now midwives working in their communities. So that's just an amazing approach that really works. Another really well-known community-based program is in Six Nations, which is in Southern Ontario. And when we're talking about success, we're talking about, I think we're getting close to 33 years. It's 32 and a half years for Nunavik and 22 and a half years for Six Nations. So we're not talking about they tried it and it worked for 5 years. These are well-established, successful examples of how community-based education can work for midwifery. So it's really wonderful to have those examples to look at. In terms of apprenticeship, I put it there because there is a method of apprenticing and becoming recognized as a midwife in the province of Manitoba through apprenticeship. But I don't know that anybody has taken that route since the college began. But of course, apprenticeship is a model that is the way that we used to learn, right? So, and I just want to point out, when we're talking about the university programs, we're talking about 1 year in the classroom, 3 years basically apprenticing, right? Where you're learning on the job, you're learning hands-on, experiential learning. It's not that far away from the way the healthcare professions and the way midwifery has always been taught and learned. And what's really interesting is a lot of the people who developed the university programs and who instruct in the university programs learned as apprentices themselves, right? So it's just staying connected to that way of learning, I think, is important, not just because it has, it's still relevant, is what I'm saying. And I mentioned here competency-based learning, because competency-based learning is just the way that most of the health professions will have an approach of, you need to be able to do these skills before you move on to the next level. And that's the way midwifery is usually done and learned, that there's kind of a progressive flow of learning and acquiring of skills and knowledge. So learning Indigenous midwifery. So when we're talking about Indigenous midwifery, everybody's always like, what makes Indigenous midwifery different? And the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives is working on a core competencies project to be able to kind of articulate that a little bit better. So I'm going to get to that. And I am going to use some slides from a presentation that my colleague has given a couple of times. But we know that we're combining knowledges and information. So just like what I talked about in my own story, having that ceremonial side, and that's the connection with the elders, while also going to university. For me, that was how I combined knowledges and information, and it really is different for everybody. But we're at a point where there's a lot of new scientific information and new available information, and it has value in different contexts, and so we kind of take that and integrate that, just as we take our the traditional knowledge and integrate that as well, hopefully, if we're able to and supported to do that kind of learning. Cultural knowledge is evidence-based, clinical, and important to maintain. And I say this because people say, well, it's not, we're in this evidence-based era of healthcare, right? Everything needs evidence. Everything needs to be researched. And what I'm saying is that research it's culturally constructed, and there are different ways of doing it. And evidence-based, I would say, when we know that, particular plant medicine has been used over thousands of years, I think that's fair evidence. And I think that just opening our minds to what is evidence and what is research can really help us to kind of look at our traditional ways and value that and see the value of maintaining that. And it is clinical, like midwives, they cared if that baby was breech or not. That was clinical knowledge to know if that baby was head down. They had different ways of turning babies, and they also had different ways of delivering breech babies. And so that becoming a clinician isn't, it looks very different now, but essentially we've always had clinical midwifery knowledge. And by that I mean kind of our ability to assess and figure out how to strategize around a particular situation to maintain a healthy situation. I mentioned here as well, Indigenous midwives have a high standard of care. And I say this because more often than not, the assumption is that we don't, which is not, it's not ideal to have that assumption, but of course we know that when we're talking about our traditions, there's often a lack of trust, but we're trained and skilled and knowledgeable care providers. We have a high standard of care. Clinical excellence is a core value of the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives, because we need our communities to be healthy. We need our communities to be well, and we need to be excellent care providers to make sure that happens. So we are, really keen to be the best providers for our communities because we can, but also because we value good care. And having other aspects of care doesn't compromise clinical care. It adds to it. Learning Indigenous midwifery is part of maintaining and continued sacred childbearing teachings and ways. So just learning, that's all I want to say about that. And then I wanted to also mention about the NACAM Indigenous Midwifery Core Competencies Project. So I guess we'll dive right in. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add that that's been a common question that I've been asked and approached along my different placements was, how do you juggle or balance your traditional learning with a Western model of clinical learning? And so it was really tough, for sure. For the first year, I'm a pretty active community member. When I'm not in school, I'm either with the youth, doing things like canoe journeys, bottle drives, fundraising, marathons. But also I like to spend a lot of time with my elders, whether that's just a cup of tea, chopping firewood, hanging out in my uncle's carving shop, and even hunting and fishing. And so hunting season starts from like September and goes to November, but that's also when my first term of practicum is. So it's kind of like, when I can, we're going to make a hunting trip. And then also fishing starts July, August, and sometimes smoking is also falls during the same time that school does. But what happens is my support system kicks in, and they're like, oh, Tia, like, we're going to take these 3 days off when you're coming into town, and we're going to go, whether it's canoeing, whether it's fishing, whether it's a day up in the mountain picking medicines or berries. And so I found out that was really grounding. So if there is time and space, your family and or supports will pull through for you. But as well as there's time and space in the program where if you have like a ceremony that's very valuable to you to go to, we have different solstices, so spring and summer, fall and winter, and so I was able to make 1 or 2 of those sometimes. But also you really, I think my learning of both the traditional knowledge and then as well as my Western education has been sometimes an overlap. So I get to hear birth stories in clinic, but also when I go back home, I get to hear birth stories, and it's very grounding. And the further I went along in my journey to midwifery, the more those came out, and the more those practices and those stories and our laws and our caring for women and kind of got relit. And so that was really beautiful. So that's kind of one of the juggles that I did, but it's harder said than done. My supports is in the interior, and the majority of my learning was on the coast. But again, Gil, there's always a will, there's a way. So it's tough, but there's, I think throughout the program, we find that support and that empowerment, whether that's us giving it to others or others giving it to us. And so it always balances out.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a really
Yeah.
beautiful perspective. I'm sure that through the process of learning kind of Indigenous midwifery, I'm sure that that's something that's really valued in terms of making space for students to continue to contribute to their communities and be integral members of their community.
So we'll be talking a little bit about the work we're doing for the UBC Midwifery Program to make sure that there's space for that. So we'll get to that in just a couple minutes too. And also just wanted to mention, for those of you who are online, we're happy to take questions as we go. We don't need to save them for the end. So if there's something that you really want to ask, just go for it, and we can pause to respond to that. So I just wanted to touch on this project because very often one of the questions that we get, or the concerns, or the conversation shifts to, okay, well, midwifery is a traditional role in our communities, but we're learning in this very colonial way, and that there's a dissonance there, right? There's a disconnect there, and as Indigenous midwives, we feel that, and we have felt that all along in the work that we do, and we're trying to be able to, first of all, find a way to articulate what makes Indigenous midwifery unique and important, particularly for our communities, but also use this as a tool for how can we maybe do some decolonizing work and shifting in different mindsets around education of Indigenous midwives. So the project, the Core Competencies project, was critical work for the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives to be doing, which I should mention. I work as the Indigenous Student Coordinator for the Midwifery Program. I'm also the Indigenous Lead for the Midwives Association of BC, and I'm the, what is my title? Oh my gosh.
So many titles, so little time.
Partnership Development Coordinator. Sorry, guys. Partnership Development Coordinator for the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives. And in this particular project, I'm involved in the sharing of this information. So I'll share fairly broadly here. So it's work around self-determination and demystifying, again, what we were saying, Indigenous midwifery practice, building awareness around Indigenous midwifery and what it is that we do and provide for our communities. And the project and having a competency framework is helping us to clearly identify and articulate how the role of Indigenous midwives differs from the roles of non-Indigenous midwives. And the tools that develop out of this project are intended to support the growth and sustainability of Indigenous midwifery in community. So we know that our communities are wanting to grow midwifery, don't often know how, don't often have the tools or resources, and so this is aimed at trying to support that. So what is a core competency framework and what is the structure? So very broadly, basically what the core competency framework is it states a competency. And so first it has 9 competency areas, which I'll mention. States a competency. So an example is the competency is that this midwife will be able to monitor the fetal growth and well-being. And so what skills are needed to practice midwifery is below that competency. So the example of this skill needed to monitor fetal growth and well-being would be, one of the skills is to palpate fetal position. That's one of the things. And so then, again, to monitor fetal growth and well-being, what knowledge is required? So there we have the midwife will need to know about the normal parameters of fetal growth and well-being. And this is a very clinical example. And then what behaviors demonstrate this skill and knowledge? So what will the midwife do to show that they are skilled at monitoring fetal growth and well-being? They'll interpret their findings and results and follow up appropriately. So the idea in this framework is that everything is delineated very clearly, simple, and that it's measurable, that it's very clear, so that if a community was looking to explore what do midwives do, what do they need to be able to do, how do we do this, that we can have a clear list of the competencies, skills, knowledge, and behavior around how learning of midwifery, what it needs to include. So the development of the core competencies, people ask us, they're like, oh wow, you made a big framework around what Indigenous midwives do. Well, how did you do that and who was involved? Of course, we always want to make sure as many people have a chance to bring their voices forward and from as many diverse settings and learning backgrounds as possible within NACM. So National Aboriginal Council of Midwives has about 120 Indigenous midwives across the country and 10 diversely trained and experienced NACM member midwives. We're talking about like very experienced midwives from coast to coast to coast got together and initiated the work of figuring out what these competency areas would be. And then the validation process took place that involved, I think, over 50% of the NACM membership altogether between webinars and review and our gathering. It was a big undertaking. So the general areas of competence are provide culturally safe care, support rites of passage, communicate, develop the profession, support Indigenous health and well-being, manage prenatal care, manage labor and delivery, provide postpartum care, and provide newborn care. So we can see when we were talking about the model and scope of midwifery, we can see provide newborn care, provide postpartum care, manage labor and delivery, manage prenatal care. Those were elements that we talked about, right? And communicate, I think, is a clear one in midwifery, like, you know, general midwifery as well. But provide culturally safe care, support rites of passage, develop the profession, and support Indigenous health and well-being are distinctly areas that are concerning for Indigenous midwives. And the way that the competency framework is made is it can be adapted to any community. So that would include, you know, for rites of passage in some communities, that will include the ceremonies around death. Right? For lots of other communities, Indigenous midwives would have a role in puberty rites, parenting rites, newborn rites, and things like that.
I'm sure that having this document really kind of flushed out aids in the development of those community-based programs that you were mentioning earlier, right?
Which is the goal.
Provides tools for people.
Yeah, which we want to talk about the pathways to midwifery education, but because they're so limited, we also want to address those pathways and create more of them, right? And this is the tool that our national council is really working on, to have this tool to be able to support communities in this work. So in terms of its application at the level of the community, it's meant to inform and support community-based recognition, so recognition of who a midwife is and what it is that they provide. Develop a performance standard so that we know that, like I said, that we have a high standard of care. We're concerned about clinical excellence, and to be able to communicate that. As application for Indigenous midwives, so how does this tool help me as an Indigenous midwife, as a care provider? It is a good continuing professional development tool for Indigenous midwives, so I can look at that and I can say, oh my goodness, I don't know enough about menopause. This is a traditional knowledge area that I should know more of, that Indigenous midwives have decided is an important area for us to really develop. We didn't learn about that in university as much as what our communities maybe need us to. So that's an area that I'm going to delve a little bit more into and learn about. So I can look at that and I can assess for myself what areas do I feel I need to grow in. And then a critical self-reflection tool to say, am I, is this the role that I have in my community? How can I be supported to do that? How can I build a network to make sure that the things that I'm not able to do or not involved in can still happen for the families in my care? So maybe I don't do a newborn welcoming ceremony, but I know the people who do, and so when a baby's born and they want to be connected in that way, I can facilitate that, right? But that's a priority for the care that I provide. The application for education, so in community, like we were saying about the community-based learning programs that can support apprenticeship training, so it provides that list of competencies that people need to be able to get and their skills. So it's a ready tool for that, which is really great. It can help with assessing readiness for independent practice. So once you have attained your competencies, we can say, okay, you're ready to be a midwife, right? And you have lots of experience and comfort with these areas of knowledge and skills, that you're ready for practice. Excuse me. And it can also help to develop a curriculum. So if a community is wanting to start a program where they don't just apprentice with a midwife who's working, but that they actually learn in a group setting, maybe, that they would have something to base their curriculum off of. And of course, that's going to differ from community to community because of the cultural diversity and the differences in priorities of our communities and what are the things that matter to learn and things like that. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, it provides kind of that skeleton of, here's something to start with, yeah. Right? And that's a really big deal because there's nothing that exists like that yet. Mm-hmm. For specifically around Indigenous communities developing these programs. And then for the universities, it can help to assess what are Indigenous students missing out of their university program, and how do we help Indigenous midwifery students in the university program to gain these competencies that aren't included in the curriculum of the university programs? Are we connecting them with elders? Are we having some sort of opportunity? Are we making sure they have extra time to spend in their communities? What is it that we're doing to make sure Indigenous students in the university programs are able to obtain their core competencies as well? Because we want people to feel ready to practice in their communities. We know that a lot of times we go to university and then we go back to our communities and we're like, oh my gosh, I have so much to learn. But we would love for people to feel ready and prepared and skilled and just ready to get right into the work as soon as they are back in their community. And that's what the idea here too. One of the areas of competencies addresses child apprehensions and having the skills to navigate the child welfare system with the families in our care and supporting families to be together and stay together. And this is really critical, and there isn't enough in education that's specifically for helping people to be really good at that kind of work, but our communities need us to be good at that work. So this is what we're talking about. How do we equip students to graduate ready for this work and make sure that they have culturally relevant and meaningful experiences as they're developing their midwifery skills, because that's part of it. And so we can create a defined standard to be met by the midwifery programs to say you need to have these elements in your program, these supports for your Indigenous students to ensure that they're meeting these competencies. And this is how we hold universities accountable, right? To make sure that Indigenous students are having the experiences that will best serve their communities when they graduate and themselves, right? Because a meaningful education keeps people in the programs and it gives them a reason to continue.
Yeah, I would say another example that I've come across that is very relevant is relearning parenting skills. Yeah. Given our history of residential school, 60 scoop, and even currently, as Evelyn addressed, the current children in care, not only are children losing their parents, but parents are losing their children and not learning and are having the time or space and support to feel, to relearn those skills of being parents again. And not only just parents, but that backtracks into grandparents and the community as a whole. Yeah. And so going into these communities, really meeting them where they're at, understanding the history is a really big part. And I think we can do a better job at that, and we're trying to do a better job at that for sure, with things like culturally safe training for healthcare providers, with students in Indigenous placements. It's slowly coming around, but again, that university curriculum doesn't cover it all.
Yeah,
yeah, that's really great. Thanks.
Yeah, so with the Core Competencies project, what the goal was to kind of find out what is the reality of how we work in our communities? Like, when we talk about what do midwives do, does that actually capture what a life is like for an Indigenous midwife working in an Indigenous community? And that's where the competencies came from, because it was like, no, actually we do all these other things, and how do we capture that? And so it was just a matter of, like what you say, supporting parenting and bonding, community bonding, not just, this kind of bonding, but this kind of bonding with everybody, and supporting those skills and wellness behaviors, right?
Involving the community and the type of care that they need, and how can we best support that, but as well as traditionally, birth wasn't just between one person and the care provider. Birth was, there was aunties, there were cousins, there were siblings, there was, as Evelyn mentioned before, there's apprenticing before that. So by the time you were ready to have a family, you might have seen it once, twice, many times over. And then as well as it's just, again, involving the type of care that they need, not us supporting, or not supporting, but just here's the menu, select what you want. It's telling us and showing us and reestablishing those relationships and how birth is community driven.
Yeah, and responsive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to mention about that project because the question is always coming up about, well, how are we going to reclaim the learning of midwifery and decolonize it? And how can we bring this to our communities? And we want a community-based program too, or we want to be able to learn through apprenticing too. And because those are questions that are always coming up, they're always concerns, I just really wanted you to know that NACM is trying hard to create tools that will be useful and meaningful and relevant in helping this work to move forward. Right now, our situation here in BC is the only way that's recognized to learn midwifery is to go through the UBC program. So we'll talk about that and what that involves. So Tia is our local expert because I went to Ryerson. And even though I am working for the program, my role is specifically around creating cultural learning opportunities for students, opportunities to connect, and for providing supports directly to Indigenous students. So Tia has a much better sense of what it's like to be in the program. So UBC Midwifery Program is what we have as an option here in BC. It is housed in the Faculty of Medicine in the Department of Family Practice. There is one campus here at the Point Grey campus, and also from years 2 to 4, there's an option to be part of a Victoria or Island cohort. And so, but that's not, so every year everybody starts here in Vancouver. It's a 4-year program, so 1 year of that is academic, where students take a whole bunch of courses that are at the Point Grey campus and also at BC Women's Hospital. And 3 years of the program is experiential learning. The final 2 years are linked together. They go year-round through the summer. There are some gaps for break, but it's good to know that those last 2 years, and that's just to be able to maintain your skill set as because if you take really, really long breaks at a time where you're really integrating your learning, the thought is that maybe that's not the best. It might put you back a little bit. So the idea is to keep up that learning. And the experiential learning component, the placements or preceptorships, they are scattered across the province. One of those placements should be rural. So at any given time, even if you identify your community as being in an urban setting and we've kind of made a plan for you to stay urban, there will be an important opportunity at some point to go to a rural placement, which is really critical for learning midwifery and any health profession. You'll find in a lot of the other health programs, they have the same value there. Let me see what I put on the next slide because I want Tia to... Do you want to say anything about this piece here?
Yeah, for sure. So as Evelyn mentioned, it's the first year is primarily based in and around Vancouver, so taking courses at UBC. Some of those courses include gender studies, anatomy and physiology. We had a creative class which was called Birth in Its Meaning, so kind of giving you a well-rounded theoretical idea of where midwifery starts. My understanding is the curriculum here is a spiral curriculum, so learning the theory, the book work, beforehand, before going out in your second year, third year, fourth year, and becoming more and more specialized in those senses. So we also learned counseling skills, which is fabulous, and as well as breastfeeding. So all setting you up on a good foot for your years to come. And then, as Evelyn also mentioned, in your second year, really kind of just getting a feel of clinical skills. Some of my cohort were previous nurses, some of them had a background in science, some of them had a background in gender studies, some of them were doulas, so all different walks of life to midwifery, which was made for a fabulous cohort. And we all had our specialties and leaned on our peers for additional supports of where we needed to. But yeah, that's kind of...
And the intensives. So I would
Right.
mention that there are times where you are learning a whole bunch of skills at the same time, and that's done through an intensive period. They tend to be 1 to 2 weeks long at any given time throughout the program. And then, of course, you're expected to take on more and more responsibility throughout your placements until at the very end you're functioning. Your last semester, you should be functioning as you would as a midwife post-graduation. So, yeah. So in terms of admissions, all university programs are always looking at their admissions processes, and every once in a while they are renewed. So I can't say that this is exactly how it's going to be in the next year, but very broadly, I will say that UBC Midwifery Program requires a couple of prerequisites that are university level. So completion of high school isn't every other program in Canada. University program is what we call direct entry. So you finish high school and then you're eligible to apply to the midwifery program, but UBC does require a couple of extra credits ahead of time. And I will put the midwifery program website here so that you can look specifically at what those are. It's only 2 or 3 classes.
Yeah, anatomy, physiology, as well as in English.
Yeah. And then there is a supplementary so then when you apply to the program, they will look at your grades. And then there's a supplementary application. So you'd be invited to provide more information on the things that you have accomplished up until that time. And then also there's an interview portion. So beyond that, when people are invited for an interview, they will be evaluated based on all of that to whether or not they're admitted to the program. This is all I can really say broadly because these things are ever changing, and that's a good thing. We want things to be responsive, and so it's a good thing. But broadly, this is the way that it's that it's done. There are 2 additional spots in the program that are for Indigenous students. So if you make the top 20, you don't take up those spots. But if you are just below the cutoff of those top 20, then, and because everybody, are probably excellent applicants. Like, it's so hard because it's such a competitive program. You might have, a whole bunch of people come for interviews, and all of them will be really great candidates. Not getting into the top 20 doesn't mean you would be an amazing midwife. Like, it's just a small program. That's the reality of it. So it's just to say that if there are a couple of extra excellent Indigenous students, they will create those spots there. And that's an important way of addressing the gaps in Indigenous healthcare providers and making sure that we're getting as many Indigenous students as we can.
Pulling in the TRC, the 94 calls to action, that being one of the first stepping stones for that.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of the way that the program is trying to evolve, so there was some advocacy work that was excellent on the part of the Indigenous midwifery students in the program to say, hey, we think maybe this could be a different experience for us. And so they created the position that I am in, which is a small position that is directly for supporting the Indigenous students, and that is the Indigenous Student Coordinator position. So that's a really exciting shift this last year. The idea, though, is broadly to make sure that there is meaningful content in the program, that Indigenous students have meaningful experiences in the program, that Indigenous students are supported, and that their student years feel sustainable to them. They feel like they can continue and do the program and complete it. That they have safe learning environments in the classroom, in their clinical setting, and that UBC can participate in the growth and evolution of a safer midwifery community. So this is because, midwives want to be safe care providers, but there is a road to go, right? Like there's always a path ahead to becoming safer care providers, and we want the midwifery community to be a safe place for Indigenous midwives and Indigenous midwifery students, because Indigenous midwifery students aren't going to be students forever. They're going to go out and be part of this community, and so the idea is that how can we contribute to that, whether it's preceptor training, or is it requiring cultural safety training to anybody who mentors an Indigenous student? Is it, like trying to build things up? This year the staff and faculty participated, and students, a lot of them participated in the blanket exercise, the Kairos blanket exercise, as a kind of unlearning and relearning activity, which is just very foundational for your next step and your next approach, right? It's a perspective shifting experience that we felt was needed and was really, really well received. And so through this work, I've been able to do some lunch and learn sessions with the staff and faculty. We've created some changes around the way that placements are done for Indigenous students, some parameters around mentoring Indigenous students, and trying just to really consider every layer of the learning experience and make sure that Indigenous students feel cared for the whole way through. Creating cultural learning opportunities. We've had 5 elders involved in the program at different stages this year, 5 or 6 maybe even. Just trying to really connect the students as a little community also, because that peer support is so critical to sustainability throughout the program years. And just really trying to think about improving students' experiences, and also making sure that the program itself is a culturally safe learning environment, and that it's a relevant place for, sometimes outdated information in any program isn't going to serve the purpose of the learning they're trying to do in that environment. So making sure that that information is up to date, and that, all the things, all the stuff. So, that's just kind of the work that we're doing here at UBC. Do you want to speak to any of those?
Yeah, I can give a few examples. So this year I was placed at Seabird Island Reserve. Throughout the years I've been asking for an Indigenous placement, because that's my intention, is to go back home and care for my community and surrounding nations. However, there wasn't really a process to go through, it was just a lottery draw. But now there's culturally safe placements where the preceptors who have taken the culturally safe training can apply to be designated rather than self-designate, which is a big difference. So like this year, I worked with Amelia Duran, who is a solo midwife for Seabird Island Reserve and the 7 surrounding communities. However, she is having a second midwife join the practice, and right away she's just like, Tia, where do I find the training? I want it to be one of the core, kind of just as important as NRP or emergency skills. They also need to be knowledgeable about culturally safe training and what our students are here for, and how we can help with that and support that. And so that was like a really good, it was like, fair enough, like here are the resources, here are the people to talk to, here's the length and like idea of it. And so again, just like taking that initiative of being better and improving. And it was very, very lovely. Whereas in the past it wasn't so much. It was more sometimes either like, oh, so what does it mean to be Indigenous? Not in that sense, but more so like, you're helping those Indians, that's great. And so it's kind of like, whoa, there's a lot of layers and a lot of things to unpack, but as well as I'm here to learn clinical skills and to learn midwifery, not to also, there's UBC's full of resources. So we're just trying to sift through those and organize those in a more appropriate and supportive way. And that example that I gave earlier with Seabird Island, that was a very supportive and positive direction of how we can get everyone on the same page with simply culturally safe training, different steps of allyship, things like that.
Yeah, and I think ultimately kind of bringing learning back to communities, right, and preparing students better for what they're hoping to face, or what they're hoping to go out into. So,
yeah,
that sounds great.
And the program is keen to learn about the Core Competency project. We haven't gotten to the point where we're talking to the university programs yet about that, but they take that seriously as well. So that's an important piece as well. And then I just had some websites here about the Midwifery Program, and also the NACM has a resource about the different education options across the country. And so I have provided the link to that as well.
Great. We'll be sure to link those in the YouTube as well, so that everybody can get at them. All
right.
Thanks very much. We actually had a question come in. I wanted to wait until a logical stop to address it. It's just kind of a general question.
Yeah.
So Karen asked, do you know how many Indigenous supported births were part of the 10,027 births? So I think what they're trying to get at is, are Indigenous people accessing midwifery to the same kind of extent as the general population? So I think that's part of it.
Know.
Do we even keep stats on that?
I would say how many Indigenous midwives practice?
That was her
UBC.
number 2. Was, do you know how
active
many
practice.
Indigenous midwives
And are
midwives are
active
practicing
practice.
across Canada?
So we have, what is that? Yeah, it's about the spread. But in terms of Indigenous midwives, there's an Indigenous midwife working within an Indigenous community in the Slocan Valley. Her practice is specifically for the Indigenous community there. And then I'm on leave from practice. We have another colleague here on the North Shore who's on leave from practice. And there's one midwife who's connecting with the communities surrounding the Victoria area. She's a relatively new midwife. And there are other Indigenous midwives kind of spattered around the province, but in terms of people who are actively involved in this work, that's kind of who we're limited to at this time. And we know of a couple of other people doing work in the surrounding areas as well. We're a small group right now compared to, in Ontario, there's 50 Indigenous midwives, right? But they also have one community-based program and 3 university programs, right? And they have different laws and processes around Indigenous midwives. And so it's a bit more of an enabling environment for Indigenous midwifery, and they've been there longer. So we're building up. We're doing what we can. I would love to know, just as much as you would, of how many of those midwife-attended births were for Indigenous families. I would love to know that answer to that question. I think you ask a really great question. I would love if that was followed statistically, and there may be a way of extracting that information based on the forms that get filled out at the birth, because there are forms there that we do fill out, but I don't think that that's information that's readily available. People would have to go in and specifically ask for that information and put it together and things like that. I think it's safe to say that midwifery is not easily accessed by Indigenous populations simply because of geographic access. If you look at the geographic spread of midwifery across the province, you will find it's almost all in the Lower Mainland. You'll find like some spatterings of midwives throughout the interior and throughout the north, but the vast majority are on the Lower Mainland. And in South Island.
Yes.
So always working to try to be more rural and to create access more rurally, because we know that there's so many First Nations and Indigenous communities that are not on the Lower Mainland. And even for those that are, in the areas that are really well served, like Vancouver and Victoria, because a lot of midwifery practices work on a first come, first served basis, people aren't always getting in. We know that Indigenous people often, not always, but often seek care a little bit later. And so, a lot of times people are in care at 6 and 7 weeks of pregnancy. And if you're Indigenous, you might not really be getting into the groove of looking for a care provider really until sometimes 15 weeks. Some people, they're looking for care at 30 weeks, so practices with policies is, so say there is a midwifery practice here in Vancouver that has a policy about late intakes. They always take people who are late to care, and that's wonderful, and we need that because we know that proportionally a lot of people will be seeking care quite a lot later into their pregnancy, and that creates access to midwives. But because midwives are in such high demand, because the wait lists are so long, a lot of the practices won't prioritize people who are later into care, don't necessarily prioritize Indigenous people seeking care. And so it just depends on the policies of those practices. We have advocated lots in this province to have spots set aside for Indigenous families that do ask, and by later to care, I mean like 10 weeks, 12 weeks, like just not at 7 weeks, to have spots open. And there are lots of practices doing that. To what degree those spots get filled, I'm not sure. Not every place always feels like a safe place, right? So we know that even when midwives are local, that we don't always have lots of access there, which I really think speaks to the importance of having Indigenous midwives, people who know their communities, know their surrounding area, know what the issues are, feel like a trustworthy person. I think that is so, that just says it there, right, of why that's so important. So we're doing what we can to grow, but we're still small. And so if you're out there and you want to be a midwife, I really believe you can do it, and I really believe it's possible, and just get in touch with us. And we're happy to field questions at any time and support anybody's pathway getting there, because we need you.
For sure. And I know some of the common barriers to coming to midwifery is that it is in Vancouver. There is a cost to living in Vancouver for your first year. However, there are also scholarships and bursaries. And I come from a single mom with 7 kids, and having that financial support really helped, but really making it a priority to, if this is part of a barrier of yours, that there are ways and supports, either through myself or Evelyn. We are creating a list of supports for Indigenous students who enter the midwifery program, for sure. There's the longhouse here, there's often meals, there's all different things, but really we need Indigenous midwives for those reasons that Evelyn outlined. And growing up in a small rural reserve where care was limited, but even having the option or a choice of a midwife makes a big difference. Having midwifery services in and around the area also dramatic changes. I can just think of like one that warms my heart is outside of Tk'emlúps. There's a community called Simp, and it's about an hour and a half depending on the road conditions, and there wasn't a home birth, or there wasn't a birth on the land till about 84, 85 years ago, and then having someone into care and having a home birth, reclaiming that, singing happy birthday in Secwepemctsín, just like tears. And so there, we are coming around, we are reclaiming, but again, we're small numbers right now, and we could grow and do even more. So
yeah.
Okay, so with that, I hope that everybody really enjoyed the conversation. If you have any last questions or comments, feel free to pop it in the chat box while I go through my little spiel here. Next week, we're going to have the Doula Collective come and join us, Miranda Kelly and Tanette Jubenville, I believe is how you say her last name, is going to come and talk to us about doulas and how they can support the birthing process. We're going to have a really comprehensive conversation, and I hope that you'll join us for that. Following that, we're going to have the Silent Genomes Project come and join us and talk to us a little bit about their work and the importance of that. So I hope that you guys will join us for that. It's on May 2nd.
Cool.
Okay, so with that, thanks again very much, everyone, for joining us. That's all the time we have for today. So have a nice day. Take care.
Bye.